While sharing can be awkward, these stories of Chase's life are also where I can go to find my footing. They are tangible pieces of him and our family. So even while feeling guarded and awkward, I am clinging to the memories like they are the only things keeping my feet on the floor. If I let go, I'll float away, and the time in my life where I was a mother to Chase here on earth will seem even less real. When it helps you find your footing, even though the pain, even through the pain, please share your memories. You know how magical that time was, and when it's right, in a special moment, there will be an audience who knows just as much as you do. Don't let the worry of how others may react make you so guarded you doubt if you should say your child's name. Share the memories and say their name. Let's start with Chase. That is an excerpt from Wishing on Rainbows by Laura Silveira, a memoir about navigating life and raising two children after losing her firstborn son in infancy. Welcome to Notes from a Ghost, a podcast about stories and the people who tell them. My name is Charlie and I'm a ghostwriter. I love a good story. I hope you enjoy this one. Laura, thanks for being here and for sharing a very difficult story. I'm surprised I made it through reading that excerpt. I was bawling reading your book so far.
That was all I kept thinking was, oh my gosh, if I do my audiobook, I'm just gonna have Charlie do
Oh
it.
no, I like don't have a voice for this. That's the
It was
podcasting
perfect.
is just me facing my fear that I my voice sucks.
I love it. It was so soothing. And the minute you started, I was like, yeah, that was gonna get me because yeah, that's a good
Mm.
one. The start of the, I guess, sharing the story with other people.
Well, I had a recent episode and we talked about writing and grief and writing through grief. And there's something I totally forgot to ask her that I'm going to ask you. And I
Okay.
know the answer because you talk about this in your book. But people talk about like the stages of grief. And is grieving linear or is it kind of all over the place? Do those stages exist?
I would if you had asked me, even while I was writing the book, and I know I talk about it in the book, I would have said is it's, and I do still say it's definitely not linear. I think after I wrote the book and I was going to get it out there, even I think 3 days ago before it got released, I asked my husband if he thought after all this I still need therapy because sometimes it's like you get so caught up in talking about it and I get so passionate about it that sometimes I wonder like, oh, does this mean like I'm still in it? Like how far am I in it? Have I gone from point A to point 8.5 and or am I, back at square one? I think it's just kind of it is definitely a fluid thing. And it can be all over the place and kind of make you question your sanity at times. For the record, anybody's totally sane, whatever stage they're at. I will caveat though that my mother-in-law passed away suddenly, like let's see, in March, a few months ago. I kind of felt like I'd had my like shark bite moment. Like if child loss is supposed to be like the worst according to everybody, then it was like, okay, I did that one. I feel like I've kind of made some progress in the, quote unquote linear chaotic mess of it all. So I'm going to be able to handle like anything that comes. This is just, it's going to be fine. It might be a little sucky, but I'll get through it. And yeah, and then we lost her, and I was just like, what the F? And
Mm.
it kind of, I did start to notice, I mean, it put me back in the raw more so. I mean, a little bit different because I was watching my husband in a different way this time around. But I did kind of see like paused and was like, oh, I think there is like a stage piece to it, so to speak, because I felt that rawness again. But I think it does get challenging when you start. Maybe it's only now that I'm talking about, maybe it's only just like the rawness presents itself again, but then you're just kind of going through the mess. But I was kind of a little surprised to see similarities, but
Mm.
I think the path through it is definitely through it with it, figuring out how to carry it is definitely, yeah, all over the map.
And it seems like one of the really strong takeaways from your book is to you kind of give people permission to give themselves permission to be all over the map
Yeah,
when they're going through that.
I definitely I feel like that's when I sat down to write it, it was I was so I wanted to share my story, but I was so nervous through the whole thing that I would come off like the stages, like you should do this, and then this is going to happen, and this is how you should feel about it. Um, that I think I finally got to a place where I was like, all I can do is tell my story and allow people to take from that. And one of my biggest things, and even when I went to grief counseling at the beginning, I was blessed to have somebody, sit across the couch from me and just say, like, you're allowed to be selfish. You're allowed to, feel what you want. I would kind of go in there some days like apologetic almost that, it was like the pressure that I was feeling to be a certain way because it's like, oh, I should be through the stage or I should do this. And I'm so grateful that early on somebody was there to tell me like there's no wrong and you can feel however that is, even if it's really, really angry or really, really sad. And there's no timetable with any of it. So even it's like I look back and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's been almost a decade. And then it's just like there are certain things that happen or whatever. It's like, no, I don't care. Like, I'm just gonna be sad today. that's just what's gonna happen. And we'll tackle tomorrow.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. And kind of going back, there was another, it was reading about your experience made me think of that earlier conversation we had on this podcast with Maria about grief. And for anyone who hasn't listened to that one, she lost her partner on Mount Everest in the 80s. And so obviously that's a very different circumstance. But she talked about one thing that I think might resonate. And she shared an awful story that her partner's climbing partner also died, and he was married. And there were people who essentially said to her, like, you're lucky you were like just his girlfriend. And you
Oh,
can't even imagine what your friend is going through who lost her husband, as if there were levels. And, she said that
yeah.
the loss of when you lose, say, a new relationship, you've lost the person, but you've also lost the future.
Mm.
While losing a child, I don't think you can compare to anything. I would imagine that double loss is there.
It is. That makes me feel I do. It's not complicated. I don't know, maybe it's complicated, but like quote unquote levels of loss, yeah, and the comparison game can be very, I don't know, it like diminishes whoever is going through something. You're somehow trying to like justify why you shouldn't feel a certain way, or somebody's forcing that on you. And I feel like in the child loss community, so many times I even would say, well, Chase was only 6 months old, only. And I was doing it to myself. And then
Mm.
it wasn't until a friend whose son had passed away in his 20s was like, stop it. Like, don't do, like, quit doing that. Cause she would look at me and say that I lost the future. I would look at her and say, like, you lost so much, but we both lost a future. It's just the matter of like where that started, that we both lost everything that was and that would be. And so that's when I felt like it's a really sucky group to be part of, but of amazing individuals. Like it's pretty awesome. Anybody who's been through something like, I think that's, grief's a connector. And I think that that's for the people that have like been through something on any level. If you can connect with somebody through that grief, then the actual loss itself becomes like a little more in the background, and it makes way for the connection to discover who people are because of that loss. And I think those relationships and people I've met through that are probably the greatest gift from it all.
And that's, I mean, that's really interesting about kind of directing that at yourself, that comparison game. I was, astonished to hear of somebody actually saying that to someone else. I mean, maybe they thought they were saying something helpful, but um, that's tough to do to yourself. Um,
Yeah.
when making those connections and kind of finding support in grief, did you ever find as though that cut you off to people who didn't couldn't relate to that experience in some way, where they almost felt like civilians or something, and they were outside of your.
That's a really great question. That's yes. I think the short answer is yes. There's a piece in the book where I talk about taking responsibility, but not in the way you think. Like when you're in the middle of it, you're like you're only capable of certain things. And so I think I spent so much energy like trying to find those connections to people that would understand my hurt and my pain and all that stuff. And in the midst of doing that, I pushed people away. And I'm sure I actually pushed people away. It's like it's so easy to walk around and say like, well, I've been through something so and so doesn't understand, but you're going to close somebody off that maybe's been through something, but you're kind of making a I don't know. Again, I'm sorry for a lot of those things that I did, but I also like I don't think it would have been any different. I wasn't in a
Yes.
space to, like be processing to say like, oh, Laura, that was kind of an a-hole move. It's just like I would have been an a-hole either way. Like if you go back, it probably isn't, hindsight. I'm like, that wasn't, but I can't, I don't know, I can't go back and change some of those things. But I do find myself, I talk about, meeting one of the girls in my mom's group and like clinging to her like she was like the only buoy in the water, like that I needed to like grab hold of. So I think there is when you go through stuff, it's just like a natural, you want to find somebody that you can connect with, hold on to. I think that's why it's like, trying to join so many, now there's so many like online support groups and all those things. And I remember going into some of them and it's like, oh my God, there's 50,000 people in here. Like look at all these people and we're all looking for it. But I think when you kind of funnel yourself into those groups, you do close off some of those people and those things that
That's a
maybe
no,
you
I'm
shouldn't have.
I'm cringing like inwardly because I'm thinking of experiences where because I've been through a few things where we've talked about this on the podcast before where it's like stuff that I would never bring up in a job interview actually might qualify me for a ghostwriting job. But some of those experiences have caused me to have much deeper empathy for other people who have quote unquote been through some shit, but at the same time, be incredibly callous and almost to the point of not believing that other people are capable of having problems if I don't think they're the kind of person who has faced. And there have been a couple of times where I get to know someone a little more. I learn that they actually have been through something challenging, and maybe they're actually doing a better job than I am because they're not as like bristly and abrasive, and that's why I didn't pick up on it. And I'm just like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm sorry. But
Yeah.
I've gotten better about treating people that way, but I still find myself dividing the world that way with at not playing the comparison game here. Nothing I'm talking about is
Yeah.
anything like losing a child,
No.
but it is funny how those experiences can
Yeah.
they can bring out the best and the worst in you at the same time.
It's so true. And I feel like too, there's people like I could sit and talk about loss and grief and because I'm it's like in every fight, it's that connector and it's the way that I cling to that and I appreciate it. And but there was something happened recently and it was like to your point, it was like they had something really horrible happen, but they're just somebody that doesn't like talking about it. And I just was like, wait, what? We're not going to talk about this at length for 5 hours. And it was eye opening because I'm like, oh my God, how many people have I talked to where they just don't feel like talking about it? Like they're fine. They're working through things probably the same way I am, or yeah, maybe even better. but it was like, they're not talking about it. So it's kind of like, I'll just keep my eyes open and just, focus on the connection.
Yes, yes. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the art and science of ghostwriting is finding those little. Now, I've even found myself working on like business books. Now we're not talking about anything that's heavy or
Yeah.
whatever, but where someone will be like, I've never even told my family this. And yeah, I call it like unlicensed therapy sometimes, what we do.
Oh my gosh, I bet. Well, when I went to that first writer's workshop before I started writing the book, and it was like you had to go around the room and like introduce yourself. I think I maybe got through my last name, maybe without crying like a little baby, for lack of a better term. But it was a nonfiction workshop. And so a memoir is just a portion of it. But I feel like, and then there were people that were going around and, oh, I'm writing an extension of my dissertation and I'm, doing this. And it wasn't until like they see the mom crying in the corner, and then as the day goes on we start to make connections, and then it's just like, oh, you're doing your dissertation but you lost both your parents at a young, and it's just, it all comes out, at some point. It just wasn't, they just were choosing not to write about it in the way that I was, but all those stories are there.
Yes, that's a really, it's a good reminder. I mean, what it's that it what's there's like a cheesy self-help version, or is it everyone's fighting a battle you know nothing about, something like that.
Yes,
But it's true. Like,
it's so true. It's so true. I think I just like, because of the way that I'm choosing to carry it, I gravitate towards the people that are louder about it. Um, and then maybe that's just my extent of, you know, the group that I found as support is just, the people that are louder, not necessarily if they've lost a child or something. Because sometimes I'll go into those child loss groups and I'm like, oh, this is too sad. I can't, can't do this. But they're not saying anything that's different than what I felt or place that I've been or that I'm still in. But it's just, I don't know. We all gravitate towards something different.
yeah, and I guess where I struggle with it is when someone, where what they're doing is just kind of a really arrogant form of denial, where it's like, I'm not talking about this because if nobody talks about it then it won't exist. And
Yeah.
because that, I feel like that almost always comes out in some other way. And those are the last people I would want around in if I'm going through something.
Yeah.
That's like the hugging, not because they want to hug you, but because they want to feel
Like,
better.
yeah, yeah, those are usually, yeah. How quickly can we wrap this up?
Tissues are over there.
Yeah. You're going through something that I don't need to be here for.
Yeah, yeah, man. Well, if somebody wants to tell their story like in writing, even if it's to themselves, and we're talking about journaling or whatever, but maybe it's a book. What would be your advice to somebody writing through grief or using writing as part of their journey to heal?
Oh, I think what stuck with me when I was writing, two things. One, to think about who you're writing for, and you need to write it. So, one, I had started my book several times and I wanted to help others who have been through specifically child loss, but grief in general. But I know they say, don't write to everybody. So I sat down initially with like such a pressure, again, because I didn't want people to think that I was writing the book on this is how it should happen and this is how you should handle it and this is what's coming next and all that stuff. But I had a good friend say, well, what if you were writing the book for Chase? And like, what if this was an extension of how you parent him? And
Wow.
yeah, and it just flipped it. It was like, it stopped being polite. Like it. I'm not mean when I write, but I could
No,
I
no.
could just feel myself just going around the edges, and it was like, oh, like this is. if I'm going to parent him, like I can't play it safe. It's like you don't tell him like, oh, the stove might be hot. It's just like, oh, this is gonna effing hurt. This is why. And so it was just like I was able to just, yeah, kind of released it. And the other thing too, when I got to places where I didn't want to write it, that's when I somebody told me that's like the moment that you need to write it. So it was like everything that I was, I'm a people pleaser, don't want to say anything that's maybe too negative. But, when you're sitting there writing by yourself, like that's it, you're by yourself. So you kind of write, you got to get it out there. And then, there's the writing process. And then I learned there was the editing process. And there's so what stays on the page is there for you. And if that ends up being there for the long run, that's great. Then, it meant something for you and you think it's important enough for other people. There were some things I wrote and I look back on it and it just wasn't, it was the more ragey side of grief. And maybe I'll share that with people at some point, like just like the really dark things, but I just didn't. Again, that kind of like circled back to me parenting Chase. And I was like, I don't want him to see me that negative. I mean, I feel like, however people think spiritual, he's definitely seen me in some negative places, but I just didn't. I talk about it a little bit, but probably not to the extent. It's like not to the extent that I'm name calling or, somebody said this and this made me feel like this. And, I realized it didn't serve me as parenting him and it didn't serve me as like going dredging stuff up for me. But I think as you write, that's your own call. But to see it in writing though was like cathartic for me to just be like, yep, that was a piece and that made me angry. And I spoke it, like wrote it out. And, sometimes that's enough. And then
Mm.
you can kind of go back. Or somebody told me to open up another doc, like during editing. It's like, if you didn't like it or you're not sure about it, just copy paste and put it over to the other one. And that way you can always bring it back. But if not, it's there just for you.
That's a really good. I love the way you said that though about politeness, and I know exactly what you mean. And for the listeners, if I understand what you're saying correctly, you
Mhm.
don't mean politeness as opposed to being rude. You mean politeness as in like tiptoeing around what you're actually trying to say or what's actually in your heart.
Exactly. Yeah. It wasn't it's like if you're writing and you're doing it for like, that's the other side. It's like you're doing it for you, but you are writing to maybe not if you're just like journaling through your own grief, but if you start to go the book route or saying, I think these words can help somebody else, then you do have to be more, the tiptoeing isn't going to work. Nobody's going to walk away feeling like they took something from it that they can do something with.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think about some of the books I love, and there's always that element. If it's about a difficult subject matter, they always go there. That's what they all have in common. And I think that's really different from books where, and it's weird. There's this paradox where I think sometimes the things you do to try to make people like you or make you the narrator or main character of your own story or what have you likable, those actually come across as disingenuous, people pleasing, try hard, pandering to the reader. Whereas like, here's how it happened, here's what was going through my head. I hope you still like me at the end of this paragraph, but you might not. Actually, that's usually everybody has those moments, and that's what we want to connect with when we read someone's story.
It's so true. I'd been looking at the words for so long, but it was like 3 days before or the weekend before the book was coming out. And I was so nervous that and terrified because I knew some of those things that I said were really raw and not things I would normally share. And I was focused on some of those in my head and I was like, oh my gosh, people are gonna read that. And like what are they gonna think? And so it was the only time I sat down and I was like, I need to read this. Like I need to read it front to back. just because I needed to remind myself, like, it wasn't just those moments. And there were, it's like, whenever I got to those really dark moments that I wrote down, there was usually something afterwards that, was like my takeaway or how I interpreted it, or like the thing that I wanted to give to the reader, like the why I shared
Hmm.
it. And then I kind of was like, it made sense. Like it was still raw and like it's out there. I can't take it back. But I felt like I did enough to say this is what, like, I'm not just painting this picture that I'm a hot mess and then opening myself up for judgment. I mean, I am. I'm okay. I think
Yeah,
there's things called internet trolls. I'm sure we'll become friends at some point, but there was meaning for it.
you'd be surprised though. Like feel like I've gone into situations where I was expecting crazy negative trolling type reviews, and I still
Yeah.
it's never really been a thing. You're right though. The other end of that continuum is the hot mess where you actually have no problem sharing what's going on. Um, but I think that consideration of who you might be helping is a great guide. I've pointed people to that as a way to not just come up with kind of the tone and tenor of what they have to say, but also to create structure in their narrative.
Yeah.
There's one thing in particular where it was a story that it was again it had to do with a loss, and it was the author comes across looking a little bit petty, but
Mm-hmm.
really sort of letting someone have it in a way where he was just driven by just unbelievable. Somebody reached out and basically was like, I didn't know that I was like allowed to feel that way about my loss until I read about
Mm-hmm.
this and in your book. And so for him, that was the sign of
That's
it was worth it. And I bring that up only to segue to so this is going to come out a little bit after we actually record it, but talking to you today, your book just dropped like yesterday, right?
yes.
What was that like?
Oh my God. It's still terrifying. I think like so far I've gotten great feedback from good friends. And as I say that, I realize this is kind of going full circle to what we talked about earlier. Those great friends have been through some shite. So, like, in that way, I appreciate what they're saying, and it must be coming from a place. It's not like, in grief, you can feel alone. So when people like pay you a compliment or something, it seems sometimes like it's coming from the outside, but then we've all been through our stuff. And so I did see last night we had to go to a function, and it was the first time I'd seen somebody, and she had read the book, and she had gone through something in her life that was horrible. She said the biggest takeaway that she got was the permission aspect, that, she didn't lose a child and that kind of stuff, but she lost somebody really important in her life. And she said, your book gave me permission to have permission to feel, how I want to feel. And it was like, if that's what people take away for, like, mission accomplished. But it was kind of where I actually, now I know what it feels like to be an influencer. I feel like that it was like my glimpse, because
Yes.
you're so focused on you write, and then there's this whole thing of like marketing. And I always used to be, even, going to school and, getting my business degree. It was just like marketing was this thing. It was like I wasn't really sure what it was, but it did stuff and it got attention to things. And especially writing something that is raw and stuff like that, which I think probably every author feels that way about, no matter what the subject. But you're kind of opening it up, and then it also becomes about like the metrics. It was just like, how many orders in the Amazon ranking, and oh, what if, and then I was panicked because I was like, what if people don't like Jeff Bezos? Like, I get it. Like, we all add to cart, but we probably hate doing it. So then it was like, oh, I got to post the Barnes and Noble link, and then I've got to show, what I'm doing that day and how I'm celebrating. And it was like, oh my God, this is exhausting. So today I'm talking to you, and I feel like I'm very quiet, but I'm still getting people, I posted like first thing in the morning, like, hey, it'd be really great if you guys could leave me an Amazon review. And they were like, I'm on page 3, Laura. Can you give me some time? It's like, oh, sure, no problem, but it's only going to mess up my ranking today. It's like, no, we're fine.
Oh,
There's some people that um, I think I still work at the same place. So when I found out Chase passed away, I was sitting at my desk at work and I still work at that same place. And so a lot of like the people that I've heard from are people that I still work with that were there on that day or, the day after. And so I've been hearing a lot from people that are inserted in the story. I'm they're not in it, but the things that I write about are they're probably going to say like, oh, I remember when that happened, or at the funeral when this happened, or whatever those things are. So I'm getting a perspective of from those people. There's some moms that I talk about that helped me through it that their children have passed away and they're reading it. So I'm really curious. I still don't have like a full lens of like what does the child lost mom think about it? What does the rainbow mom think about it? My parents love it, but they're my parents.
you've since had two children, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, their brother is very much in our household. So when I ordered my box of books from Ingram and it came and stuff, they were trying to read it. I had bigger works in there. They're 10 and 8. So they struggled through like the first page when I'm talking about my water breaking and thinking it was urine. I got through the first page. I'm like, what? Maybe it's not in the kids section of the library. That's fine. So they attempted to read a small piece of it. My daughter, who's 10, she said, well, maybe if we just pick like a chapter a night, like it's the next version of Harry Potter. And I am totally on board with that. If they want me to read it, I will wholeheartedly read it. And they've asked me questions. So I will read it to them now if they wanted to. But I look forward to when they're older, when it's I don't know what older is, but adult, whether it's high school or, they have families and they're thinking about, having kids. I think in all those stages it'll be the same story, but it'll hit them differently. It'll be, maybe if they decide to have kids or are able to have kids, and then they'll look at me as somebody who was, trying to start a family at that time and maybe not just their mom. I did kind of going back to the writing process. I thought about that a few times when I was writing dark stuff. It's like, oh, you're going to see this about your mom that she thought this, but I don't know. I wrote it anyway.
That was I've had the experience of co-authoring my dad's book, and that was one of the most surreal
Mm-hmm.
things. And that was because I think everyone gets to a point in their life where they start to realize their parents, like I think it has something to do with the age that your parents were, whatever kind of pivotal. Yeah, I can just remember thinking like he kind of stopped being my dad and started being this, young man with hopes and faults and things he wanted to do with his life and things that didn't work out. And it was really emotional to hold all of that. And it was not, not all of it was bad. A lot of it was
Yeah.
wonderful, but it was just like getting to know this new person who, even though I knew some of the stories already, they had just been stories up to that point.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear.
I know that's going to
If
be
you would have
that.
said, oh, and it really messed me up.
No, no, no. I mean, God, I mean, he definitely told me some stories I wish I could
Yeah.
unhear. No, I think that's a wonderful thought. And were you aware when you were thinking about your goals for this project, did you think about your kids reading this when they're thinking about starting a family or
I, I did. I thought about it more of like, I think maybe I'm more being in like the child loss space of grief. I'm just more attuned that it's not easy. Like having kids, and I talk about, being the bad chapter and all the what to expect when you're expecting books, and all of a sudden you're just like, well, I got through all those and even the bad ones, and now I don't know what to do. So I kind of, I don't know what the future holds, but I'm okay being that space for that. Like course, you want the easy button for your kids, but if they're struggling, it kind of makes me feel like at least, their mom can lend some insight into that struggle. And so that's kind of like I don't know, I don't know. It's like I'm not going through it at the same time, and I'm sure there'll be a million other resources, hopefully, by the time they get to that stage. But at least they'll know that, well, my mom went through this, or my mom had the same struggle, or and there are certain things too about, kind of when Chase passed away, like, and there was like, potential genetic components to that. So I'm grateful that I have them here with me. I think it's always looming, like, you know, maybe it skipped them, but they'll struggle with something that we don't know don't know now, and maybe won't know then. So I don't know. I almost feel like I don't know, a different kind of responsibility in that way, to just kind of
Interesting.
share.
Yeah, and it sounds like that dark chapter stays open in that case, which kind of brings me to something, and this might sound like the most random tangent, but
I love it already.
stick with me. So you know, a lot of the work I've done as a ghostwriter, but also on the research side of things, has been in relation to grief among veterans, survivors,
Mm-hmm.
guilt, first responders, that kind of thing. And obviously PTSD, which in the last few years, like there's just so much more that we know. And in one of the kind of really groundbreaking books about PTSD among veterans, there there's this theory put forth that we live in a society that doesn't handle death very well and doesn't have a very mature attitude towards death or ability to even talk about it. And that's extremely harmful to people who find themselves living with the reality of death. And, in that case, he's talking about veterans, but it applies more broadly. And he compares it kind of how like the Victorians sort of refused to look at sexuality as even existing. And the result is that's when serial killers became a thing, and you
Yeah.
start seeing like everything becomes about sex because it's the one topic no one's going to touch. And he said we're
Yeah.
living that in relation to death. And even
Mm-hmm.
things like consumerism, it's like, well, if I just like literally shop till I drop, I don't have to
Yeah.
think about dying, and I can just be frivolous and make my life all about comfort.
It's so true.
And I don't mean to load the question overly much, but did you find that like culturally there you didn't have a lot of tools to deal with this loss and this kind of loss?
Yes. And I feel like, I mean, the first thing is kind of going back to stages, but people, like, they don't know what to say. So I got the stack of books, my kitchen counter, because it was like, well, I don't know what to say, but here's a book and this person's supposed to know. And not knocking, like, there's definitely purpose for, the stages. And I know I mentioned, like, I do agree there's certain, things that happen in grief, but I wanted somebody to tell me about the messy, like that it's messy and it's unpredictable, and just that you're not alone, and there's nothing wrong with you. And I just don't think, I don't know, I didn't find the book that said that. I didn't like that wasn't in the book. And so I think maybe that's why I like talking about it so much, is because there was at that time, and there still is, this lack of talking about it like it's normal. When I tell people I wrote, and there are people that are celebrating and and then I go to tell them about it, and part of the time I tell them about it, if I already know that they've been through something, I say it more openly and proudly, probably. And when I'm saying it to somebody where I don't know where they're coming from, so my assumption is that maybe if they've been through something, I don't want to talk about it. If they haven't been through anything, then they definitely don't want to talk about it. And I fumble and I don't do it in a way that I'm still Chase's mom. And that really bothers me. But it's because I'm overcome, I think, by this pressure to not talk about it and not feel supported just around the general idea of grief, or even like when my mother-in-law passed away and it was sudden and I had to ask my work for, I don't know, it's just interesting to see even in like follow-up Zoom calls, people knew why I was, out making arrangements, and they might say sorry, but then there's like a okay, well, let's not talk about that anymore vibe, or maybe words, not so much to that effect. And, you realize like, oh, I'm sorry, did I just make you uncomfortable? Now I feel really awkward. I don't know what
Oh,
it's just, yeah. I mean, death affects us all. And so it is, I do feel like it's, it's odd and it can be hurtful and awkward to the point of funny sometimes, that yeah, that people, I don't know, shy away from it. But it's
um,
like, yeah, yeah,
no, that God, it's ringing so many bells. I'm sure everybody has like a version of that, and it's so funny, right? Because somebody who's doing that to you, what they're basically saying is, well, that's awkward, and they somehow think that just by like stumbling into the next topic or whatever, or making small talk,
yes.
or going quiet, that that's somehow the polite version.
Yeah, like they're helping you. Like you're welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know. And I feel like that's it, kind of like, I don't know. There's that piece that then makes way to the connections that you can make, because those people that, you know, you have a few bad encounters or awkward, or however you want to put it, and then you find the ones that like they ask you how you're doing today, or like those kind of things, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my god, you get it. Part of me is like, you're so nice, and then part of me is like, what happened to you? Let's talk about it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and again, I don't know if that's universal, but I think about even just the kind of books I like to work on, and the conversations I end up having as a result of those. My ability to go there, I can draw a straight line to stuff I went through that wasn't a lot of fun. And I don't know if it's like that for everyone. I think some people maybe they just have a natural ability to listen and not judge. But yeah, it's something people do with their faces too, where they'll like I've talked about this in relation to like interviewing skills,
Yeah.
and it's it's really funny. So like my wife writes crime novels, and she was reading I think it was on Reddit or something. It was for research, but it was about a police officer talking about like law and order. He said the biggest thing they get wrong, I mean, besides like there's shootings in every episode and this
Probably, yeah.
stuff that doesn't really happen, but he said these confrontational interrogations,
Oh,
because he's like, what you want to do, like that, you need to be that person's best friend, and once they start talking, you wanted them to keep talking. So there's no way you would be like, telling them how sick they sound, or like what a bastard they are, or like on those
yeah.
on
This is
like
how it's going to go down.
yeah, 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 like, and they're threatening them and stuff, and he's like, no, it's actually more like a sales conversation, and no matter how devious this person is, you have to actually get them talking. And luckily, as a ghostwriter, you're not necessarily talking to like criminals, but
Yeah.
people can see if you are judging them, or if you're being made uncomfortable. And they, and if your job is to interview people, you have to be able to show with your body language that you're not affected or upset by what you're hearing.
Yeah.
Otherwise you'll get the polite version, or whatever.
Hmm. It's
Um,
so true.
anyway, such a tangent. I'm sorry.
No, it's so, I just like, yeah, as you start going through the mirror of faces, yeah, that like you get over time. It's just, and it immediately, like, if you don't receive like the warm look, or you're like, oh, they're not, like, I always immediately think, like, you're not my people. Like,
Mm,
it's not in your comfort zone. It's not that I'm like angry or anything. It's just like, oh, this is just gonna get awkward, like really fast. And then all of a sudden it becomes, I feel like, on the person who's like the sharer, or the one carrying the thing to talk about, all of a sudden, it has to kind of be the turtle that goes back in the shell. And then I immediately want to make them feel better about, even though like you're the one who kind of got something like the silence doesn't necessarily just stop something from taking place. It takes it away. I think for the person that's trying to share, like if I started to say, even if I didn't get to the point where I got to say, like, my son passed away, if I get shut down at the gate and they don't even let me get there, then it's just like they took away, to your point at the beginning, like that passage, they took away my ability to talk about him. So it's sometimes it's like a polite, like, oh, we're not going to go there. Okay, that's fine. They don't want to talk about it. But sometimes it's done in a way that's even so subtle that it's just like, you shut me down and it was hurtful, even by not saying something. I don't know. And
Yeah.
I don't, and it's, you kind of just got to do that dance until you figure out which is just going to be like a polite, like, you don't get me, or a little bit on the rude side. And I'll just complain about you when my workday's done to my husband.
There, you know what? Like oh man, it's so funny. I'm thinking about very specific people who fit exactly what you're describing of that kind of, but and it sounds like the cumulative effect of enough of those interactions is real loneliness because again and again you're going to get the message of not here, not now, not this topic.
Yes, it's so true. It's so true. And then all of a sudden you're just pigeonholed into silence and carrying it by yourself.
Um, I have one last question, but first I have a quick movie recommendation.
Oh my God, yes.
And I'm going to make some people roll their eyes, but anyone who has seen this movie will get it. There is maybe you've seen it. It came out a few years ago. It's called The Babadook. It's a horror movie.
Oh my God, no. But I get scared easy. Should I still watch it?
I would say yes, only because I've showed it to some people who don't like horror movies and they loved it. It's like this Australian indie horror movie, and it's this mother and her son, and she has lost his father. I think with her husband. I won't give away too much, but basically he died, and she is not dealing with it well. So the monster in the movie is what happens when you decide that you're just gonna not talk about the thing that
That's,
needs to be addressed and you're not going to grieve and you're just going to like pretend everything's fine.
oh my God.
It's good.
I feel like now this gives me even more justification, Charlie, to just make things awkward. You don't want me to go all weird and crazy and right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, you want to make it uncomfortable. Let's continue to not talk about it and see what happens.
Yeah, and for someone who kind of can't relate to that, I would say like the strong argument for making it awkward is you never know, and to your point about helping people with your book, like you might then be leading the way and kind of giving someone permission to talk about the thing that they thought nobody wants to hear about or that they've been. And especially like I think when you're talking older generations, I mean, you might someone might read your book who has it, hasn't spoken about their loss of a child in like 50, 60 years, something like that, because they were just somewhere along the line they got the message that nobody wants to hear that and let's just leave it there.
That's so true. Because I feel like I can look at even like my parents' generation or the generation before, like, child loss was more common. I mean, the further you go back, just because of like medical or lack of advancement at that time and that kind of thing, it was more prevalent, which is crazy that it was more prevalent. But
Hand washing, right? They learned about hand washing because like I don't know the statistics, but like a lot of kids were dying in childbirth
yeah,
from doctors who had just handled like cadavers or what have you.
right. It's just like the bacteria and all the science of it. And I think there are a lot of yeah, older generation that it just don't talk about it.
Well,
It's really interesting.
maybe if you could go far enough back, it would be such a just expected part of life that would, you know.
Right?
I mean, here in Ireland, like you hear stories of, you know, I mean, that was what famine was.
Yeah.
You might have 10 kids and three of them live or something like that.
Yeah. That is so I just want to like I want to have a conversation with those people. Let's talk about it. I'm ready to talk about it.
So if you were going to write a second book, and I know that's probably a pretty big ask on the day your first one comes out, but what do you think? What would you want to write about?
Okay, well, one, I have already thought about it because it is an amazing experience. So I will put in the plug that everybody should do it. I have promised a few people that I'll do a comedy because they have to read the one that I just put out, which can be super sad. I think right now, because I'm so fresh in like the loss of my mother-in-law, that it just did surprise me. Like, I think they call it secondary loss. Um, when you, the things that you lose, like if Chase was my primary loss, my secondary is the loss of friendships or the things that stem from the initial loss. But I always feel like, it's the losses that I've had or feelings of loss that I've had since he left that have kind of, that it losing him wasn't like my shark bite moment. It's just like I'm not immune to grief and it's gonna hit me maybe just as hard. And I know maybe that's unpopular opinion because people say that child loss is the worst, but grief, I don't know, when it first smacks you, it can hurt real bad, no matter what it is. So I almost feel like, I don't know, it was like 5 years after Chase passed away, and I was in the office and my head really itched. I know this is random, but like it felt like fire ants on my head. And there had been like a scare for like a lice outbreak at my kid's preschool or something. So I was like, oh my God, I've got it. And I've got the worst case of it. Like, I'm going to go down in history. And I went to the bathroom and my scalp was bright red. And the weirdest thing, I could like pull out strands of my hair and I couldn't even feel it. It just happened so easy. And, it was coming out with the follicle. And I just thought it was so bizarre. So I was like, okay, something's not right. So I called, I don't know, dermatologist or something and got in to see them. And they looked and they were like, oh, I know what this is. Yeah, this is scarring alopecia. So once your hair falls out, it's not going to grow back. And then I was like, okay, well, am I going to be bald? And they were like, probably at some point, like it'll get to like, yeah, like probably. And it was like, well, what's the time frame? And all I could think was, I had this experience losing Chase. And it was, unless I bring it up, unless I'm uncomfortable, unless I'm that like I could hide it or I like keep it for myself. It wasn't something that people see unless I'm taking pictures at the cemetery or something like that. But then I just kept thinking, oh my gosh, like this is going to be people will see this. It's like a different form. And it's like, they're on the one hand, I'm telling myself, like, I've been through worse. I feel like we all do that, right? It's just like, oh, I've been through this horrible thing and like this isn't it. Again, stifling myself, like, so I shouldn't complain about if I'm gonna be bald. But I was still going through all these like, you know, emotions of like, this really sucks. And I feel like this is a podcast. I should tell people I do have hair. I have less hair than I do have less hair and I take, alopecia medications. I'm trying to slow it down and hold on to as much as I can. But like there's just so many different forms of it. And I strongly encourage everybody to talk about whatever it is.
And
I
there's
don't
some,
know. There's got to be something in there.
yeah, I mean, there's some really, because what you're describing, I think the generic term for everything you've talked about, and from the one end, loss of your hair to loss of your child, which might not seem like they're in the same ballpark, but I believe the generic term is stress injury. That's a term I've heard used. There's a great resource out there called the Climbers Grief Fund, I think. It's the American Alpine Association. because alpine mountain climbers die at rates that are higher than special operations in war. So it's kind of a group of people they've all lost friends. In some cases, they've lost like dozens of friends over the years. And so there's actually a resource out there where it's just tons of free information about grief and survivor's guilt. And they use the term stress injury, and there are ways to kind of even just evaluate day to day how you're doing, because stress, and again, like I'm not a doctor or psychologist. This is
Yeah.
just secondhand from doing research, but it's almost like radiation in the sense that some of it is perfectly fine and it's going to happen to you anyway. And there are certain things that are bad things that aren't actually trauma. For most people, losing grandparents is not, that's like an
Mm.
expected part of life. So it's not even, if you killed your grandparent by accident or
Yes.
something, then you might have
Yeah.
trauma. But if they just die peacefully,
Yeah.
that's actually part of life that's supposed to happen. But it could amplify other stress in your life and other loss and whatever. And it could get to where, if you're already reeling from like multiple losses, then something totally innocuous could, just like radiation, that last little dose, if you've already had a high exposure, could be way too much. And then you break down. And luckily, I mean, there are all sorts of strategies for coming back from. I mean, the big ones are like sleep, relationships, exercise, all those good things. But yeah, they're
Right.
it's pretty a fascinating science to that, because at the same time too, like your brain and your like hormonal systems, it doesn't know what stress is coming from, and it and it's, I don't know, super complicated. We need to have an actual, I've been meaning to get someone on the show who's like an actual medical professional who can talk about stress and trauma, because it's something that
Oh my
a lot of the authors I work with deal with. But yeah, they say for war photographers to like do projects that are not, where you're not just looking at mass graves all day. So like if
yeah.
your job is to go take pictures in a war zone, like Don McCullen, this British photographer, took beautiful landscapes of the place
Mhm.
around his home in England, and most of his other pictures are, I mean, some of them are too painful to look at.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like there would have to be something else there.
Well, anyway, I can talk about trauma and grief all day.
Oh my
But
gosh, I know to that point, so could I, because to the point that it's just like, could my second book be about it or should it be something different? And I think for now I'm like sitting in the, okay, if it's grief, is it because I want to talk about it? And if it's not, is it because I don't think other people want me to talk about it?
yes, well, I
Of all
gotta
the
say,
things.
like, we have had a very cheerful conversation given the topic.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I don't think it has to be all sad. And on some days when I'm not sad, that's usually when I can't go into the groups where people are fresh in grief, because even for that moment, I'm in a different mental piece. I mean, not that I can't get sad in the blink of an eye, it happens on the daily, but there is that piece to it that in writing my book, I tried to put a little bit of humor in there, because sometimes crying is just exhausting. Sometimes it turns to awkward or dark humor just because you need something to break it up. Just like, the war photographers, not to make maybe too big of a stretch, but that's something else sometimes to take away from the sadness is a few laughs. There's a an author, and she did a really successful TED Talk. Nora, well, her Instagram is Nora Borealis, but anyway, she lost her husband. She wrote the book It's Okay to Cry, Laughing is Cool Too.
Oh, that sounds great. I haven't read that.
Um, or maybe I have it the other way around. It's okay to laugh, crying is cool too. One of those. But yeah, she's always doing something about how, making something funny about, how her grief has messed her up or that kind of stuff. But she leaves you with a smile. And so I always it's appreciated.
I feel like now we're making the grief playlist, but the other one, the one that
Yeah.
I watched when it came out, and I've rewatched it since. But have you seen Afterlife on Netflix with
Oh gosh.
Ricky Gervais, the
Oh,
British
thank you.
Office?
I have not, but several people have told me I need to watch that.
I don't think anything has made me laugh or cry like that. And sometimes like one scene to the next.
Oh,
It's
that's the best.
yeah, it's really good.
All right, I'm adding that to my playlist.
But it's a lot of what you talked about. Laura, thanks so much for being here.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me on, Charlie. I really appreciate it.
Well, I will we'll put a link to your book in the show notes. Thanks again. And yeah, I did not expect to laugh this much on this.
Me either. It always feels good. Thank you.
If you have an epic story, I'd love to hear it. You can find me at dailyprose.com or on LinkedIn. My links and Laura's are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.